morning, friends, and welcome to Tea with Jess. On this week's episode, I'm talking to my dear friend, Amber Slate, who I met at Princeton Seminary. And Amber and I are talking today about bodies, about what it means to be healthy in COVID-19, and specifically how health is not linked to weight. We have bought into this larger notion of diet culture as a society. It's seeped into our church. And what does that mean for those of us who worship an incarnational God, a God who took on a body, a God who created our bodies good? So Amber and I are going to be talking about that today, and I hope that you will enjoy our conversation. I'll see you next week. Good morning, Amber.
Hi, Jess.
How are you this morning?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Good. Well, welcome to Tea with Jess. I am so excited that you're here, and I was wondering if I was open with the same question, which is, tell me about your current call. What are you doing right now?
You and I know each other because we attended Princeton Seminary together, and my first call after that was at a church in Oregon, part-time, and as I needed to make a move financially, it opened up to have a chance to work sort of more tent making style for the Tacoma School District. And all I can say is that I'm just really where I'm supposed to be right now. I don't, some calls you label as a call, official pastor job, and others, you end up filling that role even though that isn't on the job description. And during this global pandemic, what turned out is that in a school district of 30,000 students, I became the only person in the school district with a live phone. So I had people calling in with every big emotion you could imagine and sort of chaplaining them, walking through them through fear, through anger, through uncertainty. Has been really meaningful, and getting to advocate for their needs with the administration and really think what are the needs of our community. So it's turned out to be this awesome sense of call in this job that's not the label.
Yeah, that's kind of, it's so funny. The last interview that I did with my friend Buck, he was like, well, it's not like actually a call. And I was like, yes, it is a call. I think we use that term and we limit it when we only use it to pulpit ministry, but I think it stands out to everyone who has any job that is fulfilling a calling. And like your vocation can be bagging groceries. If it brings you joy and helps you reflect the kingdom of God, so I'm glad that this has turned into something more spiritual than you sort of initially thought it was going to be, for sure. And I'm also really glad you're in that position, which I've told you before many times. But I wanted to talk to you today specifically because I know that there's been a lot of talk in the media and in social media about the COVID-15, which is being compared to like the freshman 15. And it's this notion that during this season of pandemic, people aren't moving as much, they're eating a lot of comfort food, and so they're gaining weight. And I wanted to talk to you about that because I know that you've done a lot of personal work on body acceptance and on undermining what you and I know as, but maybe not the whole rest of the country yet, defines as toxic diet culture. And particularly a lot of work around this book called Health at Every Size. And so I wanted to hear a little bit more from you about your personal body acceptance journey and how you learned about this concept of health at every size.
Yeah, and not only are people talking about COVID-15, but they have a lot of big feelings about that. So, but I'll start with my story just to kind of give us some context of this conversation. And, I think like many people in our culture, I was really exposed to diet culture young. So I had this really specific memory the other day that I think will kind of illustrate things, but part of our physical education class was we were doing sort of tracking our body. So we were testing our weight and we had this little machine that we like held with 2 hands, and it read out a number, which is our percent of body fat. And there was a little chart of like most ideal and then categories below.
I'm sorry, and just to clarify, this said this out loud in a school setting in front of your peers?
Yes, as a teenage girl who had just gone through puberty. Yeah. So,
carry on, keep going. I'm feeling feelings already. I'm like feeling my blood pressure get higher. Whew.
Yeah. So as I just had this memory just come back of as this like maybe 16-year-old girl, seeing that number pop up, and right, like there was no, on the chart, there was no differentiation for like the difference between biological male and female bodies, and, you know, just any sort of sense of context. So the number that got read out was maybe like a few percentage over the ideal. But I just remember in that moment feeling a ton of shame and looking at my body and going, it's broken and I need to fix it, you know? And as I like had that memory of that 16-year-old girl, like I feel so much compassion. I feel like sadness for her, and I feel like all this empathy for all the shame she was feeling. And I feel angry that they did that and that was okay. And and not only that, but they gave me this piece of information, and they gave me facts, but they didn't give me any wisdom, right? So like I didn't have adults in my life giving me any sort of way to make meaning of that number, right? I just saw not ideal. And there was no sort of context. So, and then with no meaning making to fall back on, all I had was what was being sold to me, right? Which was diet culture. That, I mean, the advertising and diet industry is tens of billions of dollars a year industry, and they are working to sell me on their products. And that was the only option of meaning making I had, because I just didn't do it. And so first of all, I just want to say thank you so much, Jess, for being willing to have this conversation, especially as a pastor who works with youth, because, you know, just thinking of myself at that age and what we want to teach our kids, giving them options of how to make meaning of their life, of their spiritual life, of their physical life in a context that really cares about them and is really, really important. So I don't think this is a conversation that a lot of churches have. And that's so interesting to me, that church was not, I was really involved in church, and church was not a place that gave me any tools for meaning making about my body. And that is one of my primary human experiences. And as a teenager, so many changes happening to my body that I didn't have a way to make meaning of, except for maybe some shame ideas. I just think this conversation is really important. I'm really glad you're willing to have it with me. So that being said, like that was sort of my context. That's what I grew up with. And I really lived that out. I lived the diet culture life. I tried different diets, and most of them unsuccessful, and I lived in various sizes of bodies all throughout my adult life. And one of the first things that really began to shift things for me was an experience that we had together, which was the pharminary at Princeton Seminary, which was, they were sort of asking us to reflect on our theology of bodies. And I was like, why, you know, I just had never really even had like an invitation to reconsider the one option that I had always been given or only knew. So we can talk a bit more about what I found out, but that's kind of my journey, and we can flesh out more what I think now.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned something too that I just want to address, which is the churches for Christians that worship an embodied incarnational deity. We don't talk about our bodies in church. Yeah. It's like we've relegated them to sinful and problematic, and the only relationship we can have with our bodies is fixing them. Yeah. And whether that's by buying into like diet culture, which I realized we didn't define, and which is this notion that somehow your body is less than and it needs to take up less space, and therefore you have to convert your body to meet this ideal that is not natural for everyone, nor is it healthy for everyone, in order to meet society's expectations of health. And so
Yeah.
but one of the things that I think is really interesting too is that I've talked to you about this before. I have young women in my church who are recovering from eating disorders. And I've worked at other churches where young women were so consumed by the diet culture that was normative in the church setting that they almost died.
Yeah.
And as a result of that, subsequently left the church. And for an institution that is struggling and that seems so desperate to attract more people, it seems completely illogical to me that we don't start talking about bodies in ways that are actually healthy in terms of loving, supporting, and leaning towards this notion of an incarnational deity that valued bodies.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I just wanted to say that, but tell me more about health at every size and how this notion of diet culture can actually undermine health, because I think we've made it, right, weight loss equals synonymous with health, and that's not always true. And so I'm just wondering if you could talk about that a little bit.
Okay, so first I want to give a definition of health that I really love, because we throw this term out, healthy, and what does that really even mean? So let me pull this up really quick. So this is a definition that was created by the ANA faith community of nurses. So these are nurses who are really thinking through the lens of faith. And here's their definition. The definition of health is the experience of wholeness, or shalom, that is the integration of spiritual, physical, emotional, and social aspects of people to create a sense of harmony with self, others, the environment, and God. Health may be experienced in the presence or absence of disease or injury. So I wanted to talk about that because I kind of do this game with people where I sort of ask them what health means to them, just sort of get different perspectives. And I got this really interesting perspective from another nurse once, who said one of the healthiest people she knew was someone who had cancer and who was sitting in the hospital going rigorously through her life to forgive all the people that she had never forgiven, right? And that person to her was, that's going to make me cry, that's so beautiful, was an ideal of health, right? Like there's so much more, right? Like a thin person in our society who has an eating disorder might be praised for being healthy, whereas a person with fat on their bodies, who's, you know, active and enjoying life and, you know, tracks health in other ways, might be really seen as unhealthy. And so, and actually, that can often sometimes impact medical care as well. So that's something I'm really passionate about, is that, you know, sometimes a person with fat on their bodies might go into a doctor's office, and this happened to me. So for years, in different stages when I had fat on my body, I would only get prescribed weight loss, right? And that is playing right back into that dieting, which never brought me any closer to health, really. And instead, no one ever asked to look at my blood work. No one ever explored my sleep habits, and turned out I had a sleep disorder that was causing like all this harm in my life. And so, you know, you can see people as one thing, right? You can look at their body and assume something about their health. And I don't think that's really that fair. And I'm not a scientist, so I don't, there are great resources to kind of back that up. But yeah, that's sort of how I start to think about health. Was there more parts to your question?
No, I think that's a really good response to what I was asking. And I'm wondering too, to bring it back to COVID, I know, just speaking of like our judgment of bodies that have fat on them, right?
Yeah. And I'm comfortable saying fat, but like, I am fat. This is not surprising. This is not shameful. This is just a description of my body. So I know sometimes people are like, I would never call you fat. And it's like, well, what are you saying then? That fat is terrible and that I shouldn't, so it's not a bad word. I was just saying it that way to kind of just describe something.
And well, but I think that's important because I think not a lot of people know, right? Because we have affiliated fat with shame so much that fat shaming is a word, right? Like we don't know how to talk about fat bodies, right? And even saying it right now makes me uncomfortable because it feels like a judgment, and I don't want it to. What's going on with this COVID-19 thing, and why are people so terrified? Why are people so terrified of gaining weight, Amber?
Well, I think part of it's really legitimate. So if you come out of this conversation, listening to this conversation, and hear that I have bought into diet culture and therefore I'm bad and I should be ashamed of myself, I would invite you to more compassion than that, because just like my 16-year-old self, that was the only option I was ever given, right? Mm-hmm. And so of course I just did it, and it seemed natural. And I think part of that, and then the other reason that it's really legitimate is that there's truth to thin privilege in our society, right? So I know that as a fat person, I'm going to be treated differently in the doctor's office. I'm going to be treated differently at a job interview. I'm going to be the butt of the joke in the movie. It's one of the really normalized forms of discrimination still in our society. Like if you replaced some of the jokes with black and made a joke about a black person in the same way you made a joke about a fat person, it would be horrifying. But yet we still do that with fat people. And so I think there's some real fear of losing that place in society, right? Mm-hmm. Like the way I go through life is more difficult because I am in a fat body. Now, in many ways, finding health at every size has really liberated me from a lot of that internally, but externally, it's still there. So, I mean, I kind of get why people are afraid of gaining weight. But the other part of it is, I think that one of the things, I think especially as women who haven't been given as much power in society, one of the ways that we express our lack of control is by controlling our bodies. Mm. So that's always a go-to in a time of anxiety, right? So I had once a kind of a counselor, and I was going, I'm so sick of I really need to start a diet. Like this is getting out of control. And she was like, what's happening in your life right now? And I realized I was feeling out of control in all of these ways. And the way I wanted to exert control over my life was exerting control over my body. Mm-hmm. And I think this is a really hard time. There's a lot of grief that we don't really want to process. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's sort of ambiguous grief and ambiguous sadness and anger, and that so many things are wrong in the world. And our bodies are right here for us to control. But I think we ultimately pay the price for that. And I've sort of reconsidered if that's the price I'm willing to pay in my life, and it no longer is. And I think just offering that option to people can be kind of liberating to kind of show a new path.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think that's true too in terms of other ways we're trying to get control. Like a lot of people have been cleaning and organizing and doing all these home projects, and those are healthier. Those are much healthier ways of exerting your control in the world in this time of anxiety, than trying to manage your body to the extent that it actually might become more susceptible to COVID, right?
Yeah.
Which is also something we're not necessarily addressing as a society. Is you're gaining weight, that's a huge blessing when people around you are on ventilators and, and can't access food because of the issues in the economy. And really linking that to privilege, I think, is something we don't do very often. And it's become a privilege that this Western idealized body, you can afford to diet, is a privilege that we don't talk about, right? In things like The Good Earth by Pearl S. Buck in ancient China, if you carried more fat on your body, it was because you could afford to eat more and you didn't have to work as hard for a living.
Yeah.
And that was seen as the most beautiful thing that you could be because it was linked to your wealth. And so it's really interesting the way we've inverted that, so that that's become a problem when it's really, it's linked to so many other things in our society.
Yeah.
But I'm also wondering too, like, how is this related to faith? What does this have to do with being a follower of Christ?
Yeah, so I think this is one of the questions that I really started to explore at the Farminary, which sort of as I thought about my faith, I thought about what is the core component of a Reformed Presbyterian theological understanding. And really it's that grace and gratitude kind of idea. So the idea is that that God gives us good gifts and we in turn are grateful. Mm-hmm. And that's the main theological move of a Reformed faith. That good gifts can come in the form of salvation. It could come in the form of sanctification. It could come in the form of creation. It could come in the form of resurrection. But our primary stance as humans in response to God's good gifts is gratitude. And that's really a right relationship with God. And so as we were exploring theology of creation, theology of bodies, I'm going, why can't I see my body as grace, and why can't I have gratitude for it? And that really hit me. And it was like, I only can see my body as broken. I could only see my body as needing fixing, but I didn't have any gratitude for it. Mm-hmm. And that really, I think, put me out of right relationship with God. So that's the theological importance for me. And then also, in terms of what we pass down to our kids, right? In terms of the faith, is, because a lot of the things you take in about negative body image, or the term that I use is fat phobia, is that fear of fatness or hatred of fatness. No one told me directly it was bad, but I watch other women hate their bodies. Mm-hmm. And and so it's like, in terms of faith and our faith journeys, it's like, what are we really telling our kids about God's unconditional love? Mm-hmm. Do we believe it? I don't think that we always do in practice. And our kids pick up on it. I picked up on it, right? And so I think it's really important to model, or at least admit that we struggle to believe that. Mm-hmm. And that maybe we hope that they could one day.
Mm-hmm. And so that kind of goes to with this notion of like reform within the church. So you have the ability to tell people in the church 3 things right now about undermining toxic diet culture. What are the top 3 things you would like to say to parishioners, to congregants, to people that go to church about how they should promote inclusivity and love for all bodies?
Okay, so the first one is have grace for yourself. This might be a brand new idea to you. You might have looked back on your life and going, whoa. Or you might say, I believe this, but I struggle to emotionally, I believe it logically, but emotionally, it's not my experience.
Yeah.
And that's pretty normal. So I'd say just have some grace with yourself. And that stance of having compassion for yourself, having grace with yourself, is one of the best ways to lead you towards more freedom. So that's one. Number two is I really want to talk about health concern trolling. So this is sort of that idea. So let's make it not about health for a second to just kind of play it out. But so let's say I decided I wanted to go back to school, and school was going to cost, my grad program was going to cost me $10,000. And there was someone in my church who really didn't agree with that. They didn't think that was a good use of my money. They were worried for me. And they came up to me, but they wanted to still seem like they were on my side, right? They didn't want to actively be against me. So they're like, I'm just so concerned about you. I'm just concerned about your financial stuff. And that really has the power of undermining the power of my decision to, take a step in my life. Now, let's translate that to health, right? So I live in a fat body, and someone comes up to me and is like, I'm just so concerned about your health. Okay, the impact of that is shame. The impact of not actually advocating for my health in any way. So if you're concerned about someone's health, maybe don't lead with that. Actively support them. There are so many other forms of health than thinness or fatness. There's how are they sleeping? Are they stressed? Do they have access to health care? So there's a lot of ways to advocate for people to take care of themselves that aren't, singling out that they should be ashamed that they're fat. Mm-hmm. And the third thing I'd say is take a little time to educate yourself. Explore a little bit, because there's a lot of really great resources out there. One of the ones I like to recommend, because it's bite-sized, is a podcast called The Appetite. And they just explore little chunks of what health at every size could mean in someone's life. And sometimes they talk about exercise, and sometimes they talk about dieting, and sometimes they talk about Sabbath. And it's really, really neat. They run an eating disorder program, but their view is bigger than that. So, and maybe to add a fourth thing, there are people with eating disorders in your congregation, and they're very dangerous. And so the way that you promote sort of diet culture or focus on diet and thin bodies impacts especially our young people. And right now, eating disorders are the number one cause of death in the mental illness category for people in the United States. And that to me is astonishing, and we don't talk about it. Mm-hmm. I never heard us talk about eating disorders in church, but there's a lot of stuff in church that goes around, like fasting, and it's worth expanding your conversation to know about eating disorders and just to educate yourself a little bit more.
Yeah. So and this is sort of, we didn't talk about this beforehand, but I'm also wondering, with regard to fasting, I have heard in church settings, right, anything related to food is gluttonous, right? And I think that's largely where a lot of this comes from in our faith lives, is that we see gluttony as sinful.
And fasting is holy.
And fasting is holy.
Yeah.
But gluttony doesn't only refer to food. Gluttony refers to all kinds of consumptions. And in a society that really loves to consume products and all sorts of other things, you can take a fast from technology. That's become a really popular fast. Mm-hmm. You can take a fast from buying things, right? You can take a fast from being inside so much. There are all kinds of ways that you can fast, but that undermine this notion that gluttony only applies to food.
And to expand the other side of that, there are many ways to be holy around food that aren't fasting.
Yep.
So it is holy. I mean, this is what we explored at the farm, but it's holy to grow a zucchini in your garden and to taste the crispness of that zucchini and give thanks to God. Like, that is as holy or more holy, in my opinion, than abstaining from food or restricting if your motivation is really kind of more suspicious than just,
Well, and if you need to, I feel like people need to fast during Lent in particular. Like that's right. They really need to deprive themselves of something. And if you must do that with food, right? And I love your example. Why don't you deprive yourself of drinking coffee that isn't fairly traded and freely imported?
Yeah.
Right? Like you can find ways to fast that move towards justice.
Yeah.
And that aren't restrictive in terms of your own ingestion, I guess is what I'm thinking. But
yeah.
Amber, what's saving your life right now?
Okay, so one of the things about the pandemic is that I'm working from home, and I have all these feelings about my productivity from home, right? Like in some ways, like work is always here and I'm always like tempted to be working all the time, and other times I'm also always in the space that I sleep and relax and eat, and I'm always tempted to be distracted from work all the time. And it's just, and so what's saving my life right now is one, when people remind me that this is a really hard time and we're doing the best we can, that always just resets me to just grace with myself. And then the second is that I listened to this other podcast with Emily P. Freeman called The Next Right Thing, which I really love. And she gave a little tip on productivity called grace. It's allowed me to have a tool to just do the next right thing, get one thing done next. And so grace is G, get clear on the task. R, ready your workspace. A, apply a time limit. C, carry only one task. And E, end the session well. So it's like for the next 20 minutes, I'm gonna get one thing done. And let me tell you, it is saving my life right now.
Any final truth nuggets you want to share before we kind of close this conversation?
No, I think we really covered it. I think we did a good job. And thanks for having this conversation. Have it more. Have this conversation a lot.
Good. Well, I'm trying. I'm trying.
Yeah.
So thank you for being a conversation partner in this with me. And Amber asked me to pray us out this week. So I'm going to close our conversation in prayer. So let us pray, Amber. Loving God, we thank you so much for Amber and for your calling for her life and for all the ways that she is serving you and doing your work. God, we ask that you would bless her as we lead this conversation, and that you would bless us, that you would help us to hear. Let all who have ears hear what the content of this conversation has been and how it can change and shape our lives. Help us to remember, God, that you created us good, that you took on a body, all of the gross, weird, wonderful, delicious things that body can do. And help us to remember that and live into bodies as a reflection of your grace in all that we are and in all that we do. We ask all this in the name of your Son, our Savior, your incarnation on earth, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Thanks, Amber.
Thanks, Jess.
Bye.